So the Democrats released a report that says that their losses in Midwest factory towns could be a problem that makes it tough for them to win national elections. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, maybe even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So, Democratic strategists Richard Martin, David Wilhelm, and Mike Lux wrote a report that looked at Democratic performance in Midwest mid-sized factory towns. Places near where I live, actually, like Bay City and Saginaw, where my son actually lives. These places were once vibrant centers of activity where people were well paid, working in important jobs, producing the machinery and goods that were sold around the world. What made those jobs so good, of course, were the unions. Unions were strong across this region, and they fought to make sure that in the auto industry and the steel industry and the mining industry, among others, that workers benefited from the huge profits that were going primarily to the owners before. Now, unions fought some serious battles to accomplish that, but ultimately they were able to get to a point in many of these big industries. There was essentially a bit of a peace between the union and the large employers. The large employers realized it was bad for business to continually go to war with the unions, and the unions realized they didn't want to put their employers out of business. Thus began a period in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that resulted in the creation of the American middle class. Well, what changed all that? Well, on the one hand, in the 1980s, you had the increase of foreign competition. That combined with the expansion of the supply chain across international borders made it so that American workers were no longer in such a great position to demand what they wanted. Large automotive manufacturers moved factories to Mexico or Canada or other low-wage countries. And newer steel factories from places like Korea and Japan came and undermined our steel industry. Suddenly, the profits just weren't there to be shared anymore between the owners and the workers. What's more, though, is that as our economy changed and became more focused on the delivery of services and more complex tasks, too many of these industries remained non-union. The battles that had been fought by the unions to establish themselves in the big industries didn't go over into these other industries. Now, why did that happen? It happened because of the fact that Republicans, starting with President Reagan, went on a relentless attack against unions. In some respects, the right-wing swing in the Supreme Court that we're now witnessing has already been happening with respect to unions and employment rights. For all intents and purposes, the National Labor Relations Act has been absolutely emasculated, much in the way that the Supreme Court has recently attacked the Voting Rights Act. The decline in American unions can be tracked almost exactly with the increase in inequality in America. So that's certainly one reason that the extremely wealthy have fought so hard to try to destroy American unions. But that's not all, and that's what this research has shown. As it turns out, American unions, despite the fact that they were certainly not perfect, and oftentimes could be sources of racism, inequality, and sexism, were relatively speaking forces of progress in America. The fact that union power has been decimated so aggressively by Republicans is one way that they've been able to maintain their power in Congress and in the state capitals. Indeed, there's other research, which I'll also link to down below, that directly takes advantage of a natural experiment where you'll have counties in one state that's a right-to-work state and another state that's a pro-union state, right next to each other. And the research compared the Democratic performance in these two counties that are otherwise identical. Well, as it turns out, the counties where the unions are stronger tend to have higher Democratic performance. So one more way that the very wealthy and the Republicans are seeking to disenfranchise people then, and to institutionalize their own power at the expense of everybody else, is by destroying unions. Well, as it turns out in Congress, there is legislation that would address some of this, called the ProAct. Now, between the two of us, I don't think that this legislation goes far enough, frankly. But at a minimum, it's certainly a start compared to the decimation that unions have faced on the legal front for the past 40 years. I mean, after all, the last time that true pro-labor legislation was passed here in the United States was in the 1940s with the Taft-Hartley Act. It's time for us to redress the imbalance that has been caused with the relentless attack upon unions. And really, the best thing that we can do to address inequality is to give some bargaining power back to the workers. Well, with Democrats in control of Congress and the presidency, this should be something we can get done. But of course, as you know, the Republicans in the Senate are blocking it with the filibuster. If ever there were legislation that could see Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema's arms twisted sufficiently to carve an exception to the filibuster, this is it. After all, unions are a central part of the Democratic Party, and anyone who's an elected official has benefited from their involvement. As a lifelong Democratic activist, I can tell you I've worked shoulder to shoulder with union activists throughout my entire career. The Republican attack on unions has not just been an attack on workers, it's been an attack on the Democratic Party itself. As a result, I urge union leaders, I beg with them, I plead with them, pull out all the stops. Go to Senators Manchin and Sinema and insist that they carve out an exception for this and for the voting rights legislation to allow those two pieces of legislation to pass the Senate and be signed by the president. The future of our democracy and the potential of Americans to have equality in this country demand it. The lack of union pressure on this issue, frankly, has been puzzling to me, and I certainly hope that they get aggressive about it starting now. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to see your comments down below. And if you could leave a like and maybe subscribe to this channel, that'd be a huge help. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.